Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, delighted to share another calm evening of observation and reason with you. Tell me, has the lamplight found its place beside you tonight? Perhaps the rain taps softly at the window, or silence has finally settled over the room. These are the hours when Watson's pen moved most freely across the page, capturing what hurried minds too often miss. Do subscribe so no story slips past unnoticed. Now, settle in comfortably. For as we know, it is a capital mistake to theorise before one has data. You'll find Watson's Margins on Spotify as well. The link awaits you in the description below. Chapter 1. The Order of Gray's Inn. It was upon a morning in late October of the year 1895 that the affair of the vanished court docket first came to the attention of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The season had turned, and London lay beneath a pall of autumn mist that softened the harsh edges of the city and lent an air of melancholy to the streets below our sitting room at Baker Street. I had risen early and found Holmes already dressed, standing by the window with his pipe in hand, gazing down at the subdued traffic below, with that peculiar intensity that suggested his mind was already engaged upon some problem of interest. I had just settled myself with the morning papers when Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door to announce a visitor. The gentleman who followed her into our rooms was of middle years, perhaps 50. He is with the erect bearing and sober dress that spoke of a life spent in the service of the law. His face was lean and intelligent, marked by the furrows of a man accustomed to bearing responsibility, and there was about him an air of quiet distress that aroused my immediate sympathy. Holmes turned from the window and regarded our visitor with that swift, comprehensive glance that seemed to take in every detail of appearance and manner. "Good morning," said he. "You have come from Gray's Inn, I perceive, and the matter that troubles you concerns a document of some legal significance. Pray take a seat, and tell us what has brought you here at such an early hour." The gentleman started visibly. "You're quite correct, Mr. Holmes, though how you could possibly know these things is beyond my comprehension. I am Alistair Penbury. I'm senior clerk in the record department of the High Court, and I have indeed come directly from Gray's Inn." Holmes waved away the implied question with a gesture of his pipe. "The buff-coloured dust upon your left sleeve is distinctive to the older chambers at Gray's Inn. The ink stains upon your right forefinger, and the manner in which you instinctively touch your breast pocket, suggest you are accustomed to handling important documents. But pray continue. What is this matter that has brought you to consult me?" Mr. Penbury drew a deep breath and leaned forward in his chair. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I find myself in a position of extreme difficulty. For 30 years I have served the court with absolute fidelity. The records entrusted to my care are maintained with precision that borders upon the sacred. We have systems, procedures, safeguards against every conceivable irregularity, and yet yesterday evening a document of considerable importance has simply vanished from our custody." "Vanished?" Holmes inquired, his eyes brightening with interest. "Pray be more specific. What was the nature of this document?" "It was a complete court docket pertaining to the matter of Hatherley versus Hatherley, a case concerning the disputed inheritance of Sir Lionel Hatherley's estate. Sir Lionel died some 6 months ago, leaving behind a considerable fortune and a will that has become the subject of bitter contention among his surviving relatives." "I recall reading something of the matter," I interjected. "Was not Sir Lionel the gentleman who made his fortune in African mining ventures?" Mr. Penbury nodded gravely. "The same, Doctor, though I should add that Sir Lionel's business affairs were not without controversy. There were whispers, never proven, of dealings that skirted the boundaries of propriety. Nevertheless, he was a man of considerable wealth and influence, and the question of how his estate should be distributed has attracted much attention." Holmes had taken his seat opposite our visitor, and now sat with his fingertips pressed together in that attitude of concentration I knew so well. "Tell me precisely what has occurred. When was this docket last seen, and under what circumstances did you discover its absence?" "The docket was secured in its proper place in the record chamber at 6 o'clock yesterday evening. I personally verified its presence before locking the chamber for the night. The key remains in my possession at all times. This morning, when I opened the chamber to retrieve certain papers for court proceedings, I discovered that the Hatherley docket was gone. Nothing else was disturbed. There was no sign of forced entry, no damage to the lock or the cabinet in which it was stored. It has simply disappeared. Most singular, Holmes murmured. Who else has access to this record chamber? Under normal circumstances, only myself and 2 junior clerks who work under my direct supervision. However, the barristers involved in the case are permitted to examine documents by appointment, always in my presence or that of my deputies. The parties to the dispute may also view certain materials, again under strict supervision. And how many individuals would fall into these categories in the present case? Mr. Penbury counted upon his fingers. There is Miss Clara Hatherley, Sir Lionel's niece and principal heir under the earlier will. There is Mr. Edwin Markham, who served as Sir Lionel's personal solicitor for many years. Several other relatives have made claims upon the estate. Additionally, 2 barristers and their clerks have had occasion to consult the docket within the past fortnight. A considerable number, Holmes observed. And what of the junior clerks under your supervision? Both are young men of excellent character who have served with distinction. I would stake my reputation upon their honesty. Mr. Penbury paused, then added with evident reluctance, though I must admit that one of them, young Parsons, has recently experienced certain financial difficulties following the illness of his mother. Holmes made a note upon the margin of his newspaper. I see. And what is the general attitude among those connected with the case toward this disappearance? Are they alarmed? Suspicious? That is perhaps the most curious aspect of the entire affair, Mr. Holmes. When I made discreet inquiries this morning, everyone expressed appropriate concern, of course. Miss Hatherley was most sympathetic. Mr. Markham offered his complete cooperation. Yet I detected none of the agitation one might expect. They seemed almost relieved, if I may say so, rather than disturbed by the development. Most interesting indeed, said Holmes, rising from his chair with sudden animation. Watson, I think we shall take a look at this record chamber ourselves. Mr. Penbury, you will be so good as to accompany us and ensure we have access to examine the scene thoroughly. Of course, Mr. Holmes. I have a cab waiting below, and I had hoped you might consent to investigate the matter. As we descended to the street and climbed into the four-wheeler, I observed that Holmes had assumed that expression of keen, predatory attention that came over him when his interest was fully aroused. The morning mist had begun to clear, and London was awakening to its daily commerce. Yet I sensed that for my friend the true work of the day was only beginning. During our journey through the busy streets, Holmes questioned Mr. Penbury further about the security measures at Gray's Inn and the specific contents of the missing docket. I noted with interest that our visitor seemed reluctant to discuss certain aspects of Sir Lionel's business affairs, though whether from discretion or from actual ignorance I could not determine. As we approached the venerable buildings of Gray's Inn with their air of ancient authority and tradition, Holmes remarked to me in an undertone, "You observe, Watson, that we are confronted with a problem of peculiar delicacy. A document has disappeared without trace from a secure location. Those who might benefit from its disappearance show no signs of guilty knowledge. The very absence of violence or disorder suggests either remarkable skill or, perhaps more significantly, legitimate access combined with intimate knowledge of procedure. You suspect an inside man, then?" "I suspect nothing as yet, my dear fellow. I merely observe. But I think we shall find this a matter of some complexity, involving not merely the mechanics of theft, but questions of motive that may prove considerably more intricate than they first appear." The cab drew to a halt before the imposing entrance, and we alighted into the cool morning air. Mr. Penbury led us through corridors that spoke of centuries of legal tradition, their very stones seeming to embody the weight of justice and precedent. I could not shake the feeling that we were about to enter a case that would test not merely Holmes's powers of deduction, but his understanding of the human heart itself. Chapter 2. A Most Curious Absence. The record chamber at Gray's Inn proved to be a long, narrow room, situated upon the second floor of the eastern wing. Its walls were lined from floor to ceiling with cabinets of dark oak, each bearing brass plates inscribed with dates and case references. A pair of high windows admitted a filtered light that fell upon a central table where, I presumed, documents were examined under supervision. The air held that peculiar mustiness common to repositories of paper and parchment, mingled with the faint scent of sealing wax and leather bindings. Mr. Penbury unlocked the door with a key he produced from his waistcoat pocket and gestured us inside. "The Hatherley Docket was kept in that cabinet," said he, indicating a particular unit along the western wall. "Third shelf from the top, between Harrington and Havisham. The arrangement is strictly alphabetical." Holmes moved immediately to the indicated cabinet and examined it with minute attention. He produced his lens and studied the lock mechanism, the hinges, and the surrounding woodwork. I watched as he ran his fingers along the edges of the shelf, then carefully inspected the adjacent documents. Finally he straightened and turned to our client with a thoughtful expression. "You're quite correct that there is no sign of forced entry. The lock shows no scratches or other marks of tampering. The dust upon the surrounding shelves is undisturbed, save for the gap where the docket should reside." He moved to the chamber door and examined its lock with equal care. "And this door shows similar signs of normal use without violence. Tell me, Mr. Penbury, how thick was this missing docket?" "Perhaps 2 inches, Mr. Holmes. It contained all the pleadings, depositions, and correspondence relating to the case, together with copies of the various wills and codicils. A substantial document, then, not easily concealed upon one's person without careful preparation." Holmes paced the length of the room, his keen eyes taking in every detail. "Who was the last person to examine this docket before its disappearance?" "Mr. Penbury consulted a ledger he had brought with him. Mr. Edwin Markham requested access 3 days ago. He spent approximately 1 hour reviewing the materials in my presence. And his demeanour upon that occasion? Entirely professional, Mr. Holmes. He made certain notes, asked several questions concerning dates and signatures, and departed after thanking me for my assistance." "Did he seem agitated or concerned?" "Not in the least. Indeed, I remarked to my colleague afterward that Mr. Markham seemed remarkably composed, given the contentious nature of the proceedings." Holmes nodded slowly. "And Miss Hatherley? Has she consulted the docket recently?" "She came with her own solicitor a week past. A brief visit, perhaps 20 minutes. She seemed distressed by certain aspects of her late uncle's affairs, though she maintained her dignity throughout." "Distressed in what manner?" Mr. Penbury hesitated. "It is difficult to articulate precisely, Mr. Holmes. When certain documents were placed before her, documents relating to her uncle's business transactions in Africa, she grew quite pale and asked that they be returned to the file. She expressed no wish to examine them further. I observed that Holmes received this information with particular interest. He returned to the cabinet and stood before it in silence for several moments, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he spoke, it was more to himself than to us. A document vanishes from a locked chamber without trace of violence or haste. Those who stand to lose by its absence show concern but not alarm. Those who might benefit show cooperation but not curiosity." He turned to face us. "Mr. Penbury, I should like to speak with the junior clerks you mentioned, and also with Miss Hatherley and Mr. Markham, if that can be arranged." "Certainly, Mr. Holmes. My clerks are both in the building at present. As for Miss Hatherley, she resides in Kensington, and could doubtless receive you this afternoon. Mr. Markham maintains chambers in Lincoln's Inn Fields." "Excellent. Let us begin with your clerks, if you please." The 2 young men were summoned to an adjoining office where Holmes could interview them privately. The first, a serious youth named Barrett, could add little to what we already knew. Why, he had departed the building at his usual hour the previous evening, and arrived this morning to find Mr. Penbury already apprised of the situation. He had not examined the Hatherley docket himself in several weeks, and expressed genuine dismay at its disappearance. The second clerk, whom Mr. Penbury had identified as Parsons, presented a more complex figure. He was perhaps 25 years of age, with an intelligent face marked by recent strain. When Holmes questioned him about his movements on the previous evening, he answered readily enough, though I detected a certain nervousness in his manner. I remained somewhat later than usual, Mr. Holmes, assisting Mr. Penbury with an urgent matter for the Court of Chancery. We worked until perhaps 7:30, after which I departed for my lodgings in Clerkenwell. And you heard or observed nothing unusual? Parsons hesitated for a fraction of a second. I did hear footsteps in the corridor as I was preparing to leave. Heavy footsteps, such as a man of substantial build might make. But I thought nothing of it at the time. Several barristers keep late hours, and it is not uncommon to encounter colleagues in the building after normal working hours. Did you see who it was? No, sir. The footsteps were in the corridor above, and I did not investigate. At what time was this? Shortly before I left, perhaps 7:20. Holmes made a note in his pocketbook. Thank you, Mr. Parsons. You have been most helpful. After the young man had departed, Holmes turned to Mr. Penbury with a quizzical expression. You mentioned that Parsons has experienced financial difficulties. What is the nature of his situation? Our client looked uncomfortable. His mother has been seriously ill and requires constant medical attention. The expenses have been considerable, and I fear young Parsons has found himself in debt to meet them. However, I must emphasize that I have complete trust in his integrity. No doubt, Holmes replied neutrally. Nevertheless, financial pressure has been known to exert a powerful influence upon character. Tell me, what would be the value of such a docket to someone wishing to obtain it improperly? Value? Mr. Penbury seemed startled by the question. I suppose to one of the parties involved, the information it contains might be considered invaluable. To an outsider, however, it would be worthless. And the documents are legal papers, not securities or banknotes. Yet information itself may be bought and sold, Holmes observed. A man in possession of confidential legal documents might find a ready purchaser among those with an interest in the case. I saw that this possibility had not previously occurred to our client, and his expression grew troubled. Surely you do not suspect young Parsons of such a betrayal? He has always been scrupulously honest in his dealings. I suspect nothing and everything, Mr. Penbury. That is the cardinal principle of investigation. But let us proceed to interview the principles themselves. I find that direct observation often reveals more than second-hand reports. We took our leave of Gray's Inn shortly before noon, Holmes having arranged appointments with both Miss Hatherley and Mr. Markham for later that day. As we walked through the ancient courts toward the street where we might hail a cab, my friend maintained a thoughtful silence. It was not until we were settled in a hansom and making our way back toward Baker Street that he spoke. You observed, Watson, a peculiar calm that pervades this entire affair. I confess I found it somewhat unusual, I replied. One would expect greater agitation from Mr. Penbury at the very least. Indeed, and yet his distress seems to arise more from professional embarrassment than from any deeper concern about the consequences of the loss. As for the clerks, Barrett appeared genuinely ignorant, near while Parsons showed signs of anxiety that might indicate either guilty knowledge or merely the general nervousness of a man under financial strain. You think Parsons may have stolen the docket? Holmes shrugged slightly. It is certainly a possibility that will present itself readily to conventional minds. A clerk in financial difficulty, alone in the building at a late hour, in possession of keys and opportunity. The scenario writes itself. And yet I'm troubled by the very absence of disorder that Mr. Penbury described. A desperate man stealing documents under cover of darkness would surely betray some sign of haste or nervousness. The lock would be scratched, or the surrounding files disturbed, or some trace of his presence would remain. Here we have none of that. We have instead a disappearance so clean, so methodical that it suggests not furtive theft but deliberate removal by one who had every right to be there and who wished perhaps to spare everyone the unpleasantness of a more dramatic crime. You mean that someone with legitimate access simply took it? I mean, my dear Watson, that we are not dealing with a common theft at all. We are dealing with something far more subtle and perhaps far more interesting. This is not a question of who could have taken the docket, but rather who would have wanted it gone and for what purpose. The hansom had brought us to our familiar street, and we alighted before our lodgings. As we climbed the stairs to our rooms, I reflected upon Holmes's words and felt that curious mixture of confusion and anticipation that his cases so often inspired in me. The problem appeared simple on its surface, yet my friend had already perceived depths that I had entirely missed. Mrs. Hudson had left a cold luncheon for us, and we partook of it while Holmes consulted his index of biographical references. At 2:30, we set out once more, this time for Kensington, where Miss Clara Hatherley awaited our visit. Chapter 3. The Incident Defined. Miss Clara Hatherley resided in a modest but respectable house in one of the quieter streets of Kensington. The resident spoke of genteel circumstances rather than great wealth, and I found myself wondering whether this reflected her actual financial position or merely a preference for understated living. We were shown into a drawing-room furnished with taste but without ostentation, where a young woman of perhaps 30 years rose to greet us. She was tall and composed, with features that suggested intelligence and a certain strength of character. Her dress was of good quality but subdued in colour, appropriate to her continued mourning for her uncle. As she extended her hand to Holmes, I observed that her manner combined courtesy with a wariness that suggested she had already surmised the purpose of our visit. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, please be seated. I understand from Mr. Penbury's message that you are investigating the disappearance of my uncle's court papers. I am, of course, anxious to assist in any way possible." Holmes settled into the chair she indicated and regarded her with that penetrating yet not unkind gaze that I had seen him employ when interviewing those whom he did not wish to alarm. "You are very good, Miss Hatherley. I wonder if you might first tell me something of your late uncle's character. I understand he was a man of considerable business acumen." A fleeting expression crossed her face, something between sadness and discomfort. "My uncle was indeed successful in his ventures, Mr. Holmes. He began with very little and built a substantial fortune through his mining interest in South Africa. He was a man of great determination, and I believe considerable vision." "And yet," Holmes said gently, "I sense a certain reservation in your words." Miss Hatherley looked down at her hands, which lay folded in her lap. "My uncle was not an easy man to know, Mr. Holmes. He was generous to me after my father's death, providing for my education and establishing a small income for my maintenance. Yet there was always something distant in his manner, yet as though his thoughts were occupied with matters he could not or would not share. Did you know the particulars of his business affairs? Very little. He did not discuss such matters with me. I knew only that he had extensive holdings in Africa, and that he maintained a correspondence with various partners and associates overseas. When did you last examine the court docket, Miss Hatherley?" "It was a week ago last Tuesday. My solicitor, Mr. Weatherby, accompanied me to Gray's Inn. I confess I found the experience distressing." "In what way distressing?" She hesitated, and I saw her struggle with some internal conflict. "The documents contained certain letters and agreements relating to my uncle's business transactions. Some of the language employed was troubling. There were references to claims that appeared questionable, and disputes with local authorities, allegations that were never formally proven but which suggested my uncle's methods were not always above reproach." "And this troubled you?" "I had always believed my uncle to be an honourable man, Mr. Holmes. To discover evidence that suggested otherwise was deeply unsettling. I found I could not continue reading and asked Mr. Penbury to return the documents to their file." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Miss Hatherley, I must ask you a question that may seem indelicate. Do you stand to inherit your uncle's estate?" "Under his original will, yes. I was to receive the bulk of his fortune, with smaller bequests to various relatives and charitable institutions. However, I understand that he executed a new will shortly before his death, and I have not been informed of its contents. The matter is currently before the courts, And if it were to be determined that your uncle's fortune was obtained through fraudulent means, what would be the consequence? She met his eyes directly. I suppose the estate could be subject to claims, perhaps even seized by creditors or governments. I do not pretend to understand the legal complexities, Mr. Holmes, but if my uncle acted improperly, then I would not wish to profit from such actions. There was a sincerity in her voice that I found affecting, and I saw that Holmes also noted it. He rose from his chair and bowed slightly. "Thank you for your candour, Miss Hatherley. You have been most helpful. One final question, if I may. Can you think of anyone who might have a motive to steal or destroy these documents? I have thought of little else since Mr. Penbury informed me of their disappearance, Mr. Holmes. Several relatives have contested the will and might benefit from obscuring certain facts. My uncle's former business partners might wish to conceal evidence of questionable dealings. Even the charitable institutions named in the earlier will might prefer that certain revelations remain hidden, lest they be forced to refuse a bequest tainted by scandal." She paused. "I fear the list of potential suspects is rather extensive." We took our leave shortly thereafter and made our way to Lincoln's Inn Fields, where Mr. Edwin Markham maintained his professional chambers. The solicitor received us in a well-appointed office, lined with legal volumes and smelling of old paper and leather. He was a man of perhaps 55, Har with greying hair and the measured bearing of one long accustomed to handling delicate matters with discretion. "Gentlemen," said he, gesturing to chairs before his desk, "I anticipated that Mr. Penbury might seek outside assistance. This affair has placed us all in a most awkward position. You served as Sir Lionel Hatherley's personal solicitor for many years, I understand," Holmes began. "For nearly 20 years, Mr. Holmes. I handled all his legal affairs, from property transactions to the various iterations of his will. I flatter myself that I knew him as well as any man could claim to know Lionel Hatherley." "What manner of man was he?" Markham considered the question carefully. "Brilliant in business, ruthless when necessary, but not without a certain code of ethics, though that code was perhaps more flexible than conventional morality would permit. He believed that success justified methods that others might question. He was not a cruel man, but neither was he troubled by scruples that might impede his advancement." "A diplomatic assessment," Holmes observed dryly. A faint smile crossed Markham's features. "I am a solicitor, Mr. Holmes. Diplomacy is rather essential to my profession." "When did you last examine the missing docket?" 3 days ago. I wish to refresh my memory concerning certain dates and signatures before the next court hearing. Mr. Penbury was kind enough to accommodate my request." "And you observed nothing unusual? No other persons in the building? No sense of being observed or followed?" "Nothing whatsoever, and it was an entirely routine consultation." Holmes rose and began to pace the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Markham, let me speak plainly. The docket has vanished without trace. Those most closely connected with the case show concern but no great alarm. Indeed, I detect an atmosphere of almost collective relief, as though the disappearance solves more problems than it creates. Would you care to comment upon that observation?" Markham met Holmes's gaze steadily. "I would say, Mr. Holmes, that the truth about Sir Lionel's business affairs was likely to benefit no one and harm many. The estate is already contested. The charitable institutions stand to lose their bequests if fraud is proven. Miss Hatherley, an entirely innocent party, faces the prospect of public scandal and financial ruin. The disappearance of the docket may indeed spare all parties considerable distress." "Yet it remains a crime," Holmes said quietly. "Does it? Or is it perhaps an act of mercy disguised as a crime?" Markham's voice held a note of challenge. "Not all questions admit of simple answers, Mr. Holmes." "Perhaps not, but I am engaged to discover what has become of that docket, and I shall do so regardless of whether the truth proves comfortable or inconvenient." "I would expect nothing less," Markham replied. "I can only assure you that I have no knowledge of its whereabouts, and that my concern is for the proper administration of justice." As we emerged once more into the fading afternoon light, Holmes maintained a thoughtful silence. We walked some distance before he spoke. "You see how the case develops, Watson? We have established that the docket was last seen at 6 o'clock on the evening in question. Young Parsons heard footsteps in the building at approximately 7:20, yet claimed he did not see who made them. The chamber showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting that whoever removed the docket possessed both knowledge and legitimate access. The act required not impulse, but careful planning. And the motives? Multiple and overlapping. Miss Hatherley might benefit from the suppression of evidence that would invalidate her inheritance. Mr. Markham, as Sir Lionel's solicitor, might wish to protect his late client's reputation and spare the family disgrace. The various relatives and charitable institutions all have stakes in the matter. Even young Parsons in financial straits might have been tempted to sell information to an interested party. Then how are we to narrow the field? Holmes stopped and turned to face me, his eyes bright with interest. By understanding that this was not a crime of passion or desperation, Watson, it was executed with knowledge, with care, and with a clear purpose in mind. Whoever removed that docket did so not merely to benefit themselves, but perhaps to prevent a greater harm. That is the key to understanding both the method and the motive. The evening had drawn in around us, and the lamps were being lit along the street. As we made our way back to Baker Street, I found myself pondering Holmes's words and wondering what revelations the morrow might bring. Chapter 4. Threads of Intention. The following morning brought rain. A steady autumn downpour that drummed against our windows and turned the London streets into rivers of grey. Holmes had been up since dawn, engaged in correspondence and consulting various reference works, and when I descended to breakfast I found him surrounded by scattered papers and wearing that expression of concentrated thought that indicated his mind was fully occupied with the problem at hand. "Ah, Watson," said he, looking up from a letter he had been reading, "I have been considering the various strands of this case, and I confess they form a pattern more intricate than I had initially supposed. We have motives aplenty, opportunities in abundance, yet something in the whole affair strikes me as orchestrated rather than spontaneous. You believe there is some coordination among the parties? Not coordination precisely. Rather, I sense that multiple interests have converged upon a single solution, each for their own reasons, but let us not theorize in advance of our data. I've arranged for us to interview Mr. Felix Arden, the junior barrister who represented the opposing side in the inheritance dispute. He will receive us at his chambers at 10 o'clock. We made our way through the rain-soaked streets to the Temple, where Mr. Arden maintained rooms in a building that had seen better days. The barrister himself was a man of perhaps 35, lean and intense, with the air of one who had struggled to establish himself in a competitive profession. His chambers were modest, the furnishings worn but scrupulously neat, and I observed several law books lying open upon his desk, suggesting he had been engaged in research when we arrived. "Mr. Holmes, Doctor." "Watson, please forgive the humble surroundings," said he, gesturing to chairs that had been hastily cleared of papers. "I have not yet achieved the success that would permit more elegant quarters, but I understand you wish to speak with me about the Hatherley matter." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "You represented certain relatives who contested Sir Lionel's will, I believe." "I did, yes. 3 cousins who felt they had been unjustly excluded from any significant bequest. They had some legitimate grievances, Mr. Holmes. Sir Lionel had borrowed money from one of them years ago and never repaid it. Another had provided him with crucial introductions when he first went to Africa. Yet all were passed over in favour of Miss Hatherley and various institutions. And what was your strategy in challenging the will?" Arden leaned back in his chair, his fingers forming a steeple. "My approach was to demonstrate that Sir Lionel's fortune was obtained through fraudulent claims and misrepresentations to colonial authorities. If I could prove this, the estate might be subject to forfeiture, in which case the earlier will, which made more equitable provisions for the family, might be given precedence." "A bold strategy," Holmes observed, "and one that would require substantial documentation." "Precisely. The court docket contained correspondence and agreements that, Properly interpreted, suggested Sir Lionel had made false representations about mining rights and land titles. It was not conclusive evidence, but it was suggestive enough to cast doubt upon the legitimacy of his fortune. You speak in the past tense, Mr. Arden. The barrister spread his hands in a gesture of resignation. Without the docket, my case collapses. I have my own notes and copies of certain documents, but they carry little weight without the official record. The disappearance of those papers effectively ends my client's challenge to the will. And yet you do not seem unduly distressed by this development. Arden was silent for a moment, and I saw a complex play of emotions cross his features. To be entirely frank, Mr. Holmes, I have had misgivings about the case from the beginning. My client's motives are not entirely pure. They seek not justice, but money, and they would be content to destroy Sir Lionel's reputation and Miss Hatherley's prospects in pursuit of it. I took the case because I needed the work, but I confess I found little satisfaction in it. Did you examine the docket recently? I did, some 10 days ago. I spent several hours at Gray's Inn reviewing the materials with Mr. Penbury present. I made extensive notes, but as I have said, notes alone will not suffice in court. And you observed nothing unusual during your visit? Nothing. Mr. Penbury was his usual meticulous self. The documents were in perfect order. I left with the intention of preparing my arguments for the next hearing. Holmes rose and began to examine the books upon Arden's desk with that seemingly casual interest that I knew masked close attention. Tell me, Mr. Arden, if the docket were never recovered, what would be the consequence for your clients? They would lose their challenge. Miss Hatherley would inherit under whichever will the court deemed valid. The charitable institutions would receive their bequests. My clients would receive nothing beyond what Sir Lionel specified in his will, which amounts to token sums. And for yourself? I would lose a case and the associated fees. However, I would also be spared the unpleasantness of conducting a trial that might destroy an innocent woman's reputation for the benefit of clients whose motives I increasingly question. We departed shortly thereafter, and Holmes said little as we made our way back through the rain toward Baker Street. It was not until we'd returned to our rooms and shed our wet coats that he spoke at length. You perceive the pattern, Watson. Each person we interview possesses both motive and opportunity to have removed that docket, yet each also demonstrates a curious ambivalence about the crime itself. Miss Hatherley would benefit financially, but expresses moral qualms about profiting from ill-gotten gains. Mr. Markham stands to protect his client's reputation, but speaks of mercy rather than justice. Mr. Arden loses his case, but seems almost relieved by the prospect. Then which of them is guilty? Perhaps the question is not which, but whether. Consider the peculiar nature of this disappearance, Watson. No force, no haste, no trace of the perpetrator. It is almost as though the docket simply ceased to exist by mutual consent. But surely someone must have physically removed it. Undoubtedly. And yet I begin to suspect that the removal itself may have been less important than the collective decision not to pursue its recovery too vigorously. We are not dealing with a conventional crime of theft, my dear fellow. We are dealing with something far more subtle. That afternoon, Holmes insisted upon returning to Gray's Inn to conduct further examinations. Mr. Penbury received us with his usual courtesy, though I detected an increased strain in his manner. The past days had clearly weighed upon him. "Have there been any developments, Mr. Holmes?" he inquired anxiously. "Several, though their significance remains to be determined. I should like to examine the record chamber once more, if I may, and also to speak again with young Parsons." We returned to the long room with its rows of cabinets, and Holmes spent a considerable time examining the lock of the chamber door with his lens. He produced a small metal pick from his pocket and carefully manipulated the mechanism, studying its interior workings with minute attention. "Interesting," he murmured. "The lock is of good quality, but not exceptionally complex. Anyone with moderate skill and the proper tools could have duplicated a key, given sufficient time and opportunity. You believe someone made a copy? I believe it possible, Watson, but let us reserve judgment until we have heard from Mr. Parsons." The young clerk appeared promptly when summoned, and I observed that he seemed more composed than during our previous interview. Holmes regarded him with a penetrating gaze. "Mr. Parsons, I should like you to think very carefully before answering my next question. On the evening in question, when you heard those footsteps in the corridor above, are you quite certain you did not see who made them?" The young man's composure wavered slightly. I believe I said I did not see anyone, Mr. Holmes." "That is not quite what I asked. I asked whether you are certain. There is a difference." Parsons looked down at his hands. "The truth is, Mr. Holmes, I caught a glimpse of a figure ascending the stairs, but the light was dim, and I could not be certain who it was. I saw only a silhouette." "A man or a woman?" "A man, I believe, of average height and build, wearing a dark coat and hat. That is all I can say with certainty." "And why did you not mention this before?" "Because I could not identify the person, sir, and I did not wish to cast suspicion upon someone who might have been there on entirely legitimate business. Many people have access to these buildings." Holmes nodded slowly. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Parsons. You may go." After the clerk had departed, Holmes turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "We progress, Watson, though not in the direction I'd initially anticipated. Each interview reveals not guilty knowledge, but rather a shared understanding that certain truths are better left obscured. The crime, if crime it be, appears to serve multiple interests simultaneously. Then how are we to identify the culprit? By understanding the distinction between motive and intention, my dear fellow. Many had motives to see the Docket disappear, but only one had the intention to make it happen, and the courage to act upon that intention for reasons that transcend mere self-interest." The rain continued throughout the evening, and as I sat by the fire watching Holmes fill his pipe, I reflected that we were engaged in a case where the usual certainties of guilt and innocence seemed strangely blurred. Chapter 5. The Weight of Conscience. The next 2 days saw a marked change in Holmes's approach to the investigation. Rather than pursuing new interviews or examining physical evidence, he devoted himself to what he termed the study of character. This consisted largely of observation conducted from a discreet distance, supplemented by inquiries into the backgrounds and habits of our various suspects. I confess I found this phase of the work less dramatic than the initial investigation. Yet Holmes assured me it was essential to understanding the true nature of the crime. On the Thursday morning, we positioned ourselves in a cab across from Miss Hatherley's residence in Kensington. Holmes had brought a newspaper, which he affected to read while maintaining a careful watch upon the house. We remained there for the better part of 3 hours, during which time Miss Hatherley emerged twice, once to walk in the nearby gardens and once to visit a milliner's shop. Holmes observed her interactions with the shopkeeper and noted the modest nature of her purchases. "You see, Watson," said he as we finally departed, "how she conducts herself. There is no ostentation, no sign of someone anticipating a large inheritance. Indeed, her entire manner suggests uncertainty rather than confidence about her financial future. Perhaps she's merely prudent. Perhaps, or perhaps she's genuinely conflicted about the source of whatever wealth she may inherit." That afternoon, Holmes insisted we call again upon Miss Hatherley, though this time without the formality of our previous visit. We found her at home, and she received us with evident surprise. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I had not expected to see you again so soon. Has there been a development in the case?" "Nothing definitive," Holmes replied, settling into the chair she offered. "But I find myself curious about certain aspects of your late uncle's character that may bear upon the matter. You mentioned that he was generous to you after your father's death. Did he also speak to you about his business affairs?" "Very rarely, and then only in the most general terms. He would say that he had concluded a successful venture, or that certain investments had proven profitable, but he never discussed the details." "Did he ever express regret or concern about the methods by which he had acquired his fortune?" Miss Hatherley's composure faltered, and she looked away toward the window. "Once, perhaps 2 years ago, he came to visit me and seemed unusually troubled. He spoke of Africa, of the early days when he was establishing his claims. He said something I have never forgotten. He said that success in that country required a man to make compromises with his conscience, and that he had made more such compromises than he cared to remember. Did he elaborate? No. I asked him what he meant, but he waved the question away and turned to other subjects. I had the impression that he wished to unburden himself, but could not quite bring himself to do so. He died less than a year later. And when you examined the court docket, when you saw those documents that distressed you, did they confirm what your uncle had implied? She met Holmes's eyes directly, and I saw in her face the struggle between loyalty to her uncle's memory and adherence to truth. They suggested that he had made false claims about certain mining rights, Mr. Holmes, that he had misrepresented the extent of his legal authority to colonial officials, that he had obtained concessions through means that were, at best, morally questionable and, at worst, fraudulent. And how did this discovery affect your feelings about your inheritance? It made me question whether I have any right to accept it. If my uncle's fortune was built upon deception, then it seems wrong to profit from it. Yet I am also aware that refusing the inheritance would not undo the harm he may have caused, and would leave me in difficult circumstances. Holmes rose and paced to the window, gazing out at the street below. When he spoke, his tone was gentler than I had heard him employ before in this investigation. "Miss Hatherley, I wonder if you would be candid with me about one more matter. If the court docket were never recovered, if the evidence of your uncle's questionable dealings remained forever obscured, would you feel relieved or troubled?" She answered without hesitation. "Both, Mr. Holmes. You were relieved that his memory would not be publicly disgraced, and that I might inherit without scandal. Troubled that the truth would remain hidden, and that I would benefit from that concealment." We took our leave shortly thereafter, and as we walked back toward the main thoroughfare to hail a cab, Holmes remarked, "There, Watson, is a woman torn between competing obligations. She wishes to honour her uncle's memory, yet she cannot ignore evidence of his wrongdoing. She desires financial security, yet she questions her moral right to it. Such conflicts of conscience are powerful forces, capable of driving even the most honest person to consider desperate measures. You believe she removed the docket? I believe she had both motive and moral justification to do so from a certain perspective, but whether she possessed the determination to act upon those motives remains to be seen." The following day, Holmes directed our attention to Mr. Edwin Markham. Through judicious inquiries, Holmes learned that the solicitor was in the habit of working late at his chambers several evenings each week, and we contrived to encounter him as he was departing his office at 8:30. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," said he, showing only slight surprise at our appearance. "You're keeping late hours in pursuit of your investigation. As are you, Mr. Markham. Might we walk with you a short distance? There are matters I should like to discuss away from the formality of your chambers." The solicitor agreed, and we strolled together through the lamplit streets. Holmes began by asking general questions about Markham's long association with Sir Lionel, and the solicitor responded with apparent ease, describing cases he'd handled and business transactions he had facilitated. But I observed that Holmes was watching him closely, noting not merely his words but the subtle shifts in his manner as different topics were broached. "You mentioned during our previous interview that Sir Lionel's code of ethics was more flexible than conventional morality would permit," Holmes said. "Did this ever place you in a difficult position professionally?" Markham was silent for several paces. A solicitor who serves a client of strong will and questionable scruples must constantly negotiate between his duty to that client and his duty to the law. I would be dishonest if I claimed I never felt that tension. "Were there occasions when you advised Sir Lionel against a particular course of action?" "Many occasions. He did not always heed my advice, but he did listen. Toward the end of his life, I believe he'd come to question some of his earlier decisions. He altered his will several times in his final months, as though trying to achieve some form of restitution or balance." "The charitable bequests, you mean?" "Yes. He established substantial endowments for institutions working in Africa, particularly those devoted to education and legal reform. I believe he hoped these gifts might serve as a form of atonement. Holmes stopped walking and turned to face the solicitor directly. Mr. Markham, let me speak plainly. You served Sir Lionel Hatherley for 20 years. You knew the sources of his wealth and the methods by which he obtained it. You prepared his final will, which attempted to direct that wealth toward beneficial purposes. When the court case threatened to expose his fraudulent dealings and invalidate those charitable bequests, did you not feel a duty to prevent that exposure? The solicitor's face remained impassive, but I saw his hands clench briefly at his sides. A solicitor's duty, Mr. Holmes, is to serve the law and his client's legitimate interests. I have done both to the best of my ability. That is not quite an answer to my question. Perhaps because the question touches upon matters of conscience that do not admit of simple answers. I will say only this. I have acted throughout this affair in accordance with my understanding of what justice requires. Not merely what the law prescribes, Holmes nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Markham. You have been more forthcoming than you perhaps realise. As we watched the solicitor continue on his way, disappearing into the evening shadows, I turned to Holmes with a question. Do you believe he took the docket? I believe he had the knowledge, the opportunity, and the moral conviction to do so. But belief is not proof, Watson. What we have gathered thus far are impressions of character, signs of internal conflict, evidence of guilty consciences, but we have not yet discovered the crucial element that will transform these observations into certainty. We returned to Baker Street to find a message from Mr. Penbury requesting that we call upon him the following morning. The note provided no details, but its urgent tone suggested that some new development had occurred. Perhaps our answers will come sooner than I anticipated, Holmes remarked, studying the message. Tomorrow may prove illuminating. That evening, as we sat by the fire, Holmes was unusually contemplative. He smoked his pipe in silence, his eyes fixed upon the flames, and I knew better than to interrupt his reflections. When at last he spoke, it was almost to himself. The law is a blunt instrument, Watson. It recognises guilt and innocence, crime and lawful conduct. But human action is rarely so simple. We are dealing here with people who have been forced to choose between competing duties, between legal obligation and moral necessity. That is what makes this case so devilishly complex. The guilt we seek may lie not in the commission of a crime, but in the failure to prevent one, or in the attempt to serve a higher justice by violating a lesser law. I had no response to offer, and soon retired for the night, leaving Holmes to his meditations. The case had taken on dimensions I had not anticipated, and I found myself uncertain whether I wished to see it resolved. Chapter 6. Loyalty and Fear. We called upon Mr. Penbury at Gray's Inn shortly after 9 o'clock the following morning. The senior clerk received us in his office with an air of barely suppressed agitation, quite unlike his usual composed manner. Papers lay scattered across his desk, and I observed that his hands trembled slightly as he gestured us to seats. "Gentlemen, I am grateful you could come so promptly. A matter has come to my attention that may bear significantly upon your investigation. I discovered it only yesterday afternoon, quite by accident, while reviewing certain probate documents in an unrelated case." "Pray continue," Holmes said, leaning forward with keen interest. Mr. Penbury drew a folder from his desk drawer and opened it with evident reluctance. "As you know, Sir Lionel Hatherley executed a new will some months before his death. What I did not previously realise, and what I believe was known to very few people, is that he made a final codicil to that will less than a fortnight before he died. This codicil substantially altered the distribution of his estate. In what manner? The earlier version of the new will left the bulk of his fortune to Miss Hatherley, with modest bequests to various charitable institutions. The codicil reversed these proportions entirely. Miss Hatherley was to receive only a modest annual income, sufficient for her maintenance but nothing more. The remainder of the estate, the vast majority of Sir Lionel's wealth, was to be divided among 3 charitable organisations working in Africa. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the light of understanding. And who witnessed this codicil? Mr. Edwin Markham and one of his clerks. The document was properly executed and is legally binding, though it had not yet been filed with the court at the time of Sir Lionel's death. Mr. Markham was presumably waiting until after the funeral to make it public. Why would he delay? Professional courtesy, one might suppose, to give Miss Hatherley time to come to terms with her uncle's death before learning that her expectations of inheritance had been drastically reduced. Mr. Penbury paused, then added, or perhaps for other reasons that are less charitable. You believe Mr. Markham had motives for keeping the codicil secret? I believe he was placed in an extraordinarily difficult position, Mr. Holmes. Sir Lionel's instructions were clear. The codicil was to be revealed only if the charitable bequests could be protected from legal challenge. If evidence emerged that Sir Lionel's fortune was fraudulently obtained, the codicil was to be suppressed, and the earlier will was to stand. Holmes rose and paced to the window, his profile sharp against the morning light. How did you come to learn of this arrangement? By chance, as I said. I was reviewing the probate file of another client when I noticed a reference to a sealed envelope in Sir Lionel's file. Curious, I made inquiries and discovered this codicil, along with a letter of instruction from Sir Lionel to Mr. Markham. The letter makes his intentions quite explicit. Do you have that letter? Mr. Penbury produced a second document, and Holmes read it with fierce concentration. When he had finished, he handed it to me, and I read Sir Lionel's final written words with growing understanding. The letter was dated 3 weeks before his death, and written in a firm hand that betrayed no sign of physical weakness. In it, Sir Lionel acknowledged that his fortune had been built upon claims that would not withstand rigorous scrutiny. He expressed his desire to make restitution through charitable works, but recognised that such restitution would be impossible if his estate became mired in legal challenges based upon the questionable origins of his wealth. He therefore instructed Mr. Markham to ensure that the charitable bequests were protected by whatever means necessary, even if this required suppressing evidence of wrongdoing. A remarkable document, I said, returning it to Mr. Penbury. Indeed, Holmes agreed. It places Mr. Markham in the position of having to choose between revealing evidence that would invalidate the very bequests his client wished to make, or concealing that evidence in violation of his legal and professional obligations. A more perfect moral dilemma could scarcely be contrived. And Miss Hatherley, I asked, did she know of this codicil? I have found no evidence that she did, Mr. Penbury replied. The codicil had not been communicated to her as of the date the court case commenced. Whether Mr. Markham informed her subsequently, I cannot say. Holmes requested permission to examine the probate files more thoroughly, and Mr. Penbury conducted us to the archive room where such documents were maintained. For the next hour, Holmes studied not only the codicil itself, but also various correspondence between Sir Lionel and Mr. Markham during the final months of the former's life. I could see patterns forming in Holmes's mind as he traced the evolution of Sir Lionel's thinking. You see, Watson, said he at last, how the threads begin to interweave. Sir Lionel recognised the questionable foundations of his wealth and sought to direct that wealth toward beneficial purposes. But in doing so, he created a situation where those who wished to honour his final intentions were forced to suppress evidence of his wrongdoing. The docket contained precisely the evidence that would invalidate the charitable bequests. Its disappearance serves Sir Lionel's posthumous wishes while violating the law. Then Mr. Markham is your prime suspect. He had knowledge, opportunity, and what he might regard as moral justification. But let us not rush to conclusions. We must determine whether Miss Hatherley learned of the codicil, and if so, when. We departed Gray's Inn shortly before noon, and Holmes insisted upon proceeding directly to Kensington. Miss Hatherley received us with her customary courtesy, though I detected a wariness in her manner that had not been present during our earlier visits. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you find me preparing for a journey. I have decided to visit relatives in the country for a few days. The strain of these proceedings has become rather overwhelming. I quite understand, Holmes said. But before you depart, there is a matter I must clarify. Miss Hatherley, were you aware that your uncle executed a codicil to his will shortly before his death? The colour drained from her face and she sank into the nearest chair. "How did you learn of that?" "Then you did know," she nodded slowly. "Mr. Markham informed me 3 days after the docket disappeared. He said he had wrestled with his conscience about whether to reveal it given the circumstances, but felt I had a right to know the truth about my situation." "And how did you respond to this information?" "I was shocked, naturally. I had expected to inherit my uncle's fortune. To learn that I was to receive only a modest income was deeply unsettling, but I was also, in a strange way, relieved. The charitable institutions would benefit, and I would be spared the burden of accepting wealth that I had come to believe was tainted by my uncle's actions." "Did Mr. Markham explain the conditions attached to the codicil?" "He said that my uncle wished the charitable bequest to be protected from legal challenge, and that if evidence of fraud became public, the codicil might be set aside in favour of the earlier will. He seemed quite troubled by the entire situation." Holmes stood in the centre of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, regarding Miss Hatherley with an expression that mingled sympathy and scrutiny. "I must ask you a direct question, Miss Hatherley, and I beg you to answer with complete honesty. Did you have any knowledge of the docket's disappearance before it occurred?" She met his gaze steadily. "No, Mr. Holmes. I learned of it the following day when Mr. Penbury sent me a note. When Mr. Markham told me about the codicil several days later, I admit I wondered whether there might be some connection, but I have no direct knowledge of how the docket disappeared or who took it." "Yet you must have considered the implications. With the docket gone, the evidence against your uncle's business dealings cannot be presented in court. The charitable bequests are protected. Your uncle's final wishes can be fulfilled." "I have thought of little else, Mr. Holmes, and I confess I am torn between gratitude that the scandal has been averted and discomfort at benefiting, however indirectly, from what may have been a criminal act." After we had taken our leave and were once again in the street, Holmes maintained a thoughtful silence. We walked for some distance before I ventured to speak. "She seems genuinely conflicted." "She is conflicted, Watson. That much is certain. But conflict does not preclude action. Indeed, it may make action more likely when one feels compelled to resolve an intolerable dilemma." He paused, then added, "We are dealing with people who have been forced into impossible positions by circumstance and by the contradictory demands of law, loyalty, and conscience. Each has reason to welcome the docket's disappearance, while deploring the means by which it occurred. Then how are we to determine who actually took it? By finding the one element that distinguishes determination from mere wish, Watson. By discovering who possessed not only the motive and opportunity, but also the specific knowledge and preparation necessary to execute this particular crime in this particular manner. And I believe I am beginning to see where that knowledge must have come from." The afternoon was well advanced, and as we made our way back toward Baker Street, I sensed that Holmes was approaching the resolution of the case, though the final pieces had not yet fallen into place. Chapter 7. The Convenient Explanation. It was upon the Monday following our interview with Miss Hatherley that the case took an unexpected turn. Holmes and I had spent a quiet weekend at Baker Street, during which my friend devoted himself to chemical experiments and the study of certain documents he had obtained from Gray's Inn. He had grown increasingly taciturn, a sure sign that his mind was working toward some conclusion, and I knew better than to press him for his theories before he was ready to articulate them. We were at breakfast when Mr. Penbury arrived unannounced, his face bearing an expression of mingled distress and relief. Mrs. Hudson showed him up immediately, and he accepted a cup of coffee with hands that shook noticeably. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I bring news that I confess leaves me deeply troubled. Young Parsons has been arrested." Holmes set down his newspaper with studied calm. "Indeed? On what charge?" "Theft of the court docket. Inspector Bradstreet of Scotland Yard came to Gray's Inn yesterday afternoon with a warrant. It appears that Parsons has confessed to taking the documents." I saw Holmes's eyes narrow slightly, though his voice remained neutral. "Tell us precisely what occurred." Mr. Penbury drew a folded newspaper from his coat pocket and placed it upon the table. "The matter came to light through an anonymous letter sent to Scotland Yard. The letter suggested that Parsons, being in financial difficulties, had stolen the docket with the intention of selling information to interested parties. When confronted by Inspector Bradstreet, Parsons apparently broke down and admitted to the theft. Holmes unfolded the newspaper and read the brief article detailing the arrest. Does this account accord with what you observed directly? I was present when Inspector Bradstreet questioned Parsons. The young man seemed utterly overwrought. He admitted that his mother's medical expenses had driven him to desperate measures, that he had remained in the building after hours on the evening in question, and that he had taken the docket from the record chamber. He claimed he had not yet found a buyer for the information, and that the documents were hidden in his lodgings. And were they found there? No. Parsons claimed they had been destroyed in a fit of remorse. He said he burned them 2 days after taking them, realizing the enormity of what he had done but lacking the courage to return them or confess. Holmes rose from the table and stood by the window, gazing down at Baker Street. How very convenient. Convenient, Mr. Holmes? A confession that explains the disappearance, implicates someone already under a cloud of suspicion, and eliminates the need for the docket itself to be produced. Tell me, Mr. Penbury, and did Inspector Bradstreet seem satisfied with this explanation? He appeared entirely convinced. He remarked that financial pressure had driven many an honest man to crime, and that Parsons' evident remorse spoke in his favour. The inspector believes the case is now closed. No doubt he does. Holmes turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. And what of the other parties involved? How have they responded to this development? Miss Hatherley sent a note expressing sympathy for young Parsons and offering to assist with his legal defence. Mr. Markham called upon me to discuss the implications for the probate proceedings. With the docket destroyed, the court will have to proceed based upon secondary evidence and testimony. The inheritance case will likely be resolved in favour of the charitable institutions, in accordance with Sir Lionel's final wishes. All very tidy, Holmes murmured. Mr. Penbury, you said you're troubled by these developments. Why? The senior clerk hesitated, choosing his words with care. I have known young Parsons for 3 years, Mr. Holmes. He is conscientious, honourable, and devoted to his duties. The idea that he would betray the trust placed in him seems contrary to everything I have observed of his character. And yet, when Inspector Bradstreet confronted him, he confessed immediately. It was almost as though he had been expecting the accusation and had prepared himself to accept it. Mr. Penbury looked startled. Yes, precisely that. There was something rehearsed about his demeanour, as though he were reciting lines rather than spontaneously unburdening his conscience. Holmes resumed his seat and steepled his fingers beneath his chin. I think we must speak with young Parsons ourselves. Can that be arranged? He's being held at Bow Street. I believe visits are permitted, though under supervision. Then let us go at once, Watson, if you would be so kind as to accompany us. Within the hour we had made our way to Bow Street Station, where Inspector Bradstreet greeted us with a mixture of cordiality and faint condescension. He was a stout, red-faced man who had worked with Holmes on several previous occasions, though their relationship had not always been harmonious. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I understand you have been investigating this matter on behalf of the courts. I am pleased to report that we have our man safely in custody. A straightforward case of theft driven by financial desperation. So I understand, Holmes replied. Nevertheless, I should like to speak with the prisoner if you would permit it. Certainly, though I doubt you will learn anything beyond what he has already told us. The fellow was quite forthcoming once confronted with the evidence. We were conducted to a small interview room where Parsons sat at a plain wooden table, his hands clasped before him. He looked up as we entered, and I was struck by the change in his appearance. The nervous anxiety that had marked our earlier interviews had been replaced by a dull resignation that seemed almost peaceful. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, said he quietly. I suppose you've heard what I have done. Holmes took the seat opposite him and studied the young man's face with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see beyond surface appearances. I have heard what you claim to have done, Mr. Parsons. Whether it accords with the truth is another matter entirely. Parsons' composure wavered for an instant. "I do not understand your meaning, sir." "Do you not? Then let me be plain. You are a man of intelligence and education, yet you would have me believe you conceived and executed a theft that required intimate knowledge of legal procedures, access to secure premises, and the ability to remove a substantial docket without leaving a trace. You would have me believe that you then destroyed documents worth considerable sums rather than attempting to profit from them. And you would have me believe that you confessed to this crime upon the slightest pressure from the police, without attempting to negotiate terms or protect yourself legally. I am guilty, Mr. Holmes. What more can I say? You can say why you are protecting someone else." The words hung in the air between them, and I saw Parsons' hands tighten upon the table. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I am protecting no one. I acted alone, out of desperation and greed. I have brought shame upon myself and upon Mr. Penbury, who placed his trust in me." Holmes leaned forward. "Mr. Parsons, I have examined the lock mechanism of the record chamber. It would require considerable skill to duplicate a key or to pick the lock without leaving marks. Do you possess such skills?" "I obtained a duplicate key." "From whom?" "From a locksmith in Clerkenwell. I told him I had lost my key to the office." "The name of this locksmith?" Parsons hesitated. "I do not recall. A small shop near my lodgings." "Yet you remember precisely what you told him, and why you went there. Curious that you should forget the name." Holmes stood abruptly. "Mr. Parsons, you are lying to protect someone, and you are doing so at great cost to yourself. I wonder whether the person you are protecting is worth such a sacrifice. I have told you all I can, Mr. Holmes. Then I fear you condemn yourself to a fate you do not deserve." As we left the interview room and made our way back through the station, Inspector Bradstreet approached us with a satisfied expression. "Well, Mr. Holmes, are you convinced of his guilt?" "I'm convinced that he has confessed to the crime. Whether those are the same thing remains to be determined." "Come now, surely you do not doubt his word? The man has admitted his actions." "Men confess to crimes they did not commit for many reasons, Inspector. Fear, loyalty, despair, or the desire to shield others from consequences. Young Parsons exhibits all these motivations in abundance." Bradstreet's face reddened. "You suggest he is innocent despite his confession? On what grounds?" "On the grounds that his story contains inconsistencies that a man of his intelligence would not make, were he truly recounting events he had experienced. On the grounds that his manner suggests rehearsed testimony rather than genuine recollection, and on the grounds that his confession serves the interests of several other parties far more than it serves his own." "That is mere speculation, Mr. Holmes." "Perhaps. But I have learned to trust speculation grounded in observation over confessions motivated by obscure loyalties." We emerged into the pale afternoon light, and as we walked back toward Baker Street, I ventured to ask the question that had been forming in my mind. "You believe Parsons is innocent, then?" "I believe he is a pawn, Watson, sacrificed to protect a more valuable piece. The question is whether he has made this sacrifice voluntarily or under duress, and whether we can prevent the perpetrator from escaping justice behind the shield of a false confession. But who would have such influence over him?" Holmes did not answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of grim determination. "That is what we must discover, my dear fellow, and we must do so quickly, before an innocent man is convicted of a crime he did not commit, and before a guilty conscience mistakes false resolution for true justice." The case, which had seemed to reach its conclusion, had instead entered a new and more troubling phase. Chapter 8. The Overlooked Detail. Holmes spent the remainder of that day in a state of intense mental activity. He dispatched several telegrams, consulted his commonplace books, and made various notes in his distinctive angular handwriting. I knew better than to interrupt him during these periods of concentration, though I confess my curiosity was considerable. It was not until late evening, as we sat before the fire, that he finally spoke of what was occupying his thoughts. "Watson, I find myself confronted with a problem of considerable delicacy. We have a confession that solves the immediate mystery yet creates a deeper one. Young Parsons has admitted to a crime, the authorities are satisfied, and all interested parties appear relieved by the resolution. To pursue the matter further might seem officious, even vindictive, and yet I cannot dismiss the conviction that an innocent man is being sacrificed to preserve a fiction that serves everyone's interests save his own, and that of justice. What will you do? I shall return to the beginning. When faced with a solution that seems too convenient, one must re-examine the original evidence with renewed scepticism. Tomorrow we shall revisit Gray's Inn, and I shall conduct a more thorough examination of that record chamber than I have yet attempted. True to his word, Holmes roused me early the following morning, and we arrived at Gray's Inn before 8 o'clock. Mr. Penbury, though surprised by our early appearance, readily granted us access to the record chamber. Holmes dismissed him with courteous firmness, explaining that he needed to work without distraction. For more than 2 hours I watched as Holmes examined every aspect of that long, narrow room. He studied the floorboards for signs of unusual wear, the windowsills for traces of ingress, and the cabinets for any indication of tampering. He measured distances, noted the placement of furniture, and scrutinized areas I would have thought entirely irrelevant to the investigation. Throughout this process, he maintained an almost absolute silence, occasionally making brief notes but offering no commentary. It was nearly 10:30 when he returned his attention to the door lock itself. He had examined it before, of course, during our initial investigation, but now he approached it with fresh intensity. Producing his lens and a small set of tools from his pocket, he began to dismantle the mechanism with the skill of a trained locksmith. I moved closer to observe as he worked, watching as he removed the faceplate and exposed the interior workings of the lock. For several minutes he studied it in silence, then suddenly he uttered a low exclamation of satisfaction. "Watson, bring me that lamp from the table." I complied, holding the lamp close as Holmes directed its light into the lock mechanism. With a pair of fine tweezers, he extracted something from within the assembly and held it up to the light. "Do you see this, Watson?" I leaned closer and observed what appeared to be a tiny fragment of red material, no larger than a pinhead. "It appears to be some kind of wax or resin." "Precisely, sealing wax to be exact, and its presence here is highly significant." He produced a small envelope from his pocket and carefully deposited the fragment within it. "This lock has been recently compromised, not by force, but by craft. Someone created an impression of the key, most likely using this very sealing wax pressed into soft clay or a similar material. The key was then duplicated, and traces of the wax remained within the mechanism. But Parsons claimed he had a duplicate key made, so he did. Yet when I questioned him about the locksmith, he could provide no satisfactory details, because, Watson, there was no locksmith. Parsons did not make this duplicate key. Someone else did, someone with access to the original and with the foresight to plan this theft well in advance. Then who? Holmes reassembled the lock with deft movements and straightened. That is the question we must now answer. The presence of sealing wax narrows our suspects considerably. Who among our cast of characters would have both access to sealing wax in their daily work and opportunity to obtain an impression of Mr. Penbury's key? A solicitor or barrister would certainly use sealing wax for documents. Indeed, as would clerks and legal professionals of all descriptions. But consider the timing. This key impression was made recently within the past few weeks. The lock shows signs of having been cleaned and maintained, yet the wax fragment was embedded deeply enough to have survived that routine maintenance. It was placed there shortly before the docket disappeared. We returned to Mr. Penbury's office, where Holmes requested records of all persons who had visited the record chamber during the 3 weeks preceding the theft. The senior clerk consulted his meticulous logs and provided a list of names with dates and durations of visits. Holmes studied the list with fierce concentration. Mr. Markham visited on the Tuesday before the disappearance. Miss Hatherley came the previous week. Mr. Arden examined documents 10 days prior. Each of these individuals had opportunity to obtain an impression of your key, Mr. Penbury. The question is which of them possessed the necessary skill and determination to act upon that opportunity. Surely you do not still suspect these persons, Mr. Holmes. Young Parsons has confessed. Confessions may be false, as I have explained. This physical evidence, however, does not lie. Someone created a duplicate key through careful preparation. That person then used it to remove the docket from this chamber. Parsons' confession is an attempt to shield the true perpetrator from consequences. But why would he do such a thing? That is a question we shall address presently. For now, I wish to know more about the circumstances surrounding his financial difficulties. You mentioned his mother's illness. Can you provide details? Mr. Penbury retrieved a file from his desk. His mother has been under the care of Dr. Thornley in Clerkenwell for the past 6 months. The treatments have been expensive, and Parsons has borrowed money to cover the costs. He owes approximately £60 to various creditors. A substantial sum for a young clerk. Has anyone offered to assist him with these debts? Not to my knowledge, though I myself provided him with a small advance on his wages some weeks ago. Holmes made a note of this, then rose to depart. Thank you, Mr. Penbury. You have been most helpful. I believe we are approaching the resolution of this matter, though perhaps not in the manner the authorities expect. As we left Gray's Inn and made our way through the busy streets, Holmes walked with that quick, purposeful stride that indicated his mind was racing ahead to some conclusion. When we'd hailed a cab and were travelling toward Clerkenwell, he finally spoke. "We're going to interview Dr. Thornley. I wish to learn the true state of Mrs. Parsons's health and the exact nature of her treatment. You believe there is something irregular about her illness. I believe nothing as yet. But I find it curious that Parsons would confess to a crime that yields him no financial benefit, when his stated motive was the need for money to pay medical expenses. If he had truly stolen the docket with intent to sell information, why would he destroy it before realizing any profit? And why would he confess before attempting to negotiate the payment of his mother's debts as a condition of his cooperation? We found Dr. Thornley's surgery in a respectable though modest neighbourhood. The physician received us in a consulting room lined with medical texts and smelling faintly of carbolic. He was a man of middle years with the weary but compassionate bearing of one who had devoted his life to the care of the poor. "I am treating Mrs. Parsons for consumption," he explained, after Holmes had introduced our purpose. "She has been quite ill, though I'm pleased to say she has responded well to rest and proper nutrition. The treatments I have prescribed are not particularly expensive by medical standards, though they have placed a burden upon her son's modest income." "How much would you estimate the total cost of her care over the past 6 months?" Dr. Thornley consulted his records. "Perhaps £20 in total. I have charged young Parsons reduced fees in consideration of his circumstances." Holmes and I exchanged glances. £20? Yet we understand he has accumulated debts of £60. "That I cannot explain, Mr. Holmes. My fees account for only a portion of that sum." As we departed the surgery and stood upon the street, Holmes's expression had grown grim. "Do you see it now, Watson? Parsons' debts are 3 times the cost of his mother's care. Where has the remainder gone? To whom does he owe it? And why has he been so anxious to conceal these facts? You believe someone has purchased his confession. I believe someone has given him compelling reasons to accept responsibility for a crime he did not commit, whether through promises of financial assistance, threats against his mother's continued care, or appeals to his sense of loyalty and duty. Parsons has been manoeuvred into a position where confession seemed his only option. Then who orchestrated this?" Holmes did not answer immediately. We walked in silence until we reached a busier thoroughfare where cabs might be found. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of reluctant certainty. Someone with intimate knowledge of Parsons' circumstances, someone with the resources to offer or withhold assistance, Someone who understood that a false confession would serve multiple interests simultaneously while protecting the true perpetrator from scrutiny. He paused, then added, someone who has been positioned at the centre of this affair from the beginning, and who has guided its resolution with subtle but unmistakable purpose. Markham? I believe so, Watson, though proof is another matter entirely. We have physical evidence that the lock was compromised using sealing wax. We have Parsons' confession that strains credulity. We have unexplained debts that suggest influence or coercion. But we do not yet have a chain of evidence that would convince a court of law. What will you do? I shall confront Mr. Markham directly and present him with what we have discovered. A man of conscience, when faced with the consequences of his actions, may choose truth over continued deception. And if I am correct about his character, he will not permit an innocent man to suffer for his crime. As we made our way back to Baker Street to prepare for this final confrontation, I reflected upon the complexity of the case and the human dimensions that made it so much more than a simple matter of theft. Chapter 9. The Truth Revealed. It was late afternoon when we arrived at Mr. Markham's chambers in Lincoln's Inn Fields. The shadows were lengthening across the courtyard, and a chill had crept into the air that spoke of winter's approach. Holmes had sent word ahead requesting an interview on a matter of urgency, and the solicitor's clerk showed us directly into the private office where we had met before. Markham rose from his desk as we entered, and I observed that he appeared more careworn than during our previous encounters. There were deep lines around his eyes, and his movements carried a heaviness that suggested the weight of sleepless nights. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, your message indicated you had made progress in the investigation. I confess I'm surprised, given that young Parsons has confessed and the authorities consider the matter closed. The authorities are satisfied, Holmes replied, settling into a chair with deliberate calm. But satisfaction and truth are not always synonymous. I have asked you to receive us because I believe you are a man who values truth above convenience, however painful that truth may prove. Markham resumed his seat slowly. I am not certain I understand your meaning. Then permit me to be explicit. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes fixed upon the solicitor's face. Someone removed the Hatherley Docket from the record chamber at Gray's Inn. That person possessed both legitimate access to the building and intimate knowledge of Mr. Penbury's security procedures. That person also had the foresight to create a duplicate key using sealing wax, which I discovered embedded in the lock mechanism this morning. Young Parsons has confessed to this crime, yet his confession contains numerous inconsistencies that betray its falsity. I believe Parsons is protecting someone, and I believe that someone is you, Mr. Markham. The silence that followed was profound. Markham sat motionless, his hands resting upon the desk before him. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. That is a serious accusation, Mr. Holmes. Upon what evidence do you base it? Upon several converging lines of inquiry. First, the physical evidence of the duplicate key, which required skills and materials commonly available to a solicitor, but not to a junior clerk. Second, Parsons' unexplained debts, which exceed his mother's medical expenses by a factor of 3, suggesting external influence or obligation. Third, your unique position at the centre of this affair. You alone knew the contents of Sir Lionel's final instructions to protect the charitable bequests by any means necessary. You alone had access to both the record chamber and the knowledge of when the docket would be most vulnerable, and you alone had the moral conviction to act upon Sir Lionel's implicit permission to suppress damaging evidence. Markham's expression had not changed, but I saw his hands tighten almost imperceptibly upon the desktop. Ingenious reasoning, Mr. Holmes, yet it remains speculation. Does it? Then let me add one more element to my reconstruction. You visited the record chamber 3 days before the docket disappeared. During that visit, you requested that Mr. Penbury absent himself briefly while you made certain notes. In those moments alone, you pressed your key into sealing wax and created an impression from which a duplicate could be made. You then had that duplicate fashioned, returned to Gray's Inn on the evening in question, and removed the docket using your copied key. No force was necessary because you had legitimate access. No unusual behaviour would be remarked upon because you were known to work late hours. The crime was executed with the precision and confidence of someone who had every right to be there. And Parsons? Parsons had the misfortune to be in the building that evening and to catch a glimpse of you in the corridor. You recognised that he might eventually piece together what he had seen. Rather than risk exposure, you approached him subsequently and offered him a bargain. You would pay his debts and ensure his mother received continued care if he would accept responsibility for the theft. To a young man in desperate circumstances and possessing a misguided sense of loyalty to his betters, such an offer might seem acceptable, even noble. For a long moment Markham remained silent. Then quite unexpectedly he rose from his chair and moved to the window overlooking the courtyard. When he spoke he did not turn to face us. "You are substantially correct, Mr. Holmes. Though you have misunderstood certain aspects of my arrangement with Parsons, I did not threaten him, nor did I purchase his silence through crude bribery. I presented him with the facts of the situation and left the decision to his conscience." "What facts?" Markham turned now, and I saw in his face a mixture of resignation and defiance. That Sir Lionel Hatherley, despite his flaws, had attempted in his final months to make restitution for wrongs he had committed. That the docket contained evidence that would destroy not only his reputation, but also the charitable institutions he had endowed. That Miss Hatherley, who bore no responsibility for her uncle's actions, would be subjected to scandal and financial ruin. That 3 African orphanages, 2 schools and a hospital would lose their funding if the estate were invalidated. I told Parsons that I had removed the docket to prevent these consequences, and I explained that if the authorities learned the truth, all of Sir Lionel's efforts at redemption would be negated. And Parsons agreed to confess in your place? He understood the situation and made his own choice. And I offered to pay his debts and to establish a fund for his mother's care, but I also told him that he was free to go to the authorities if his conscience demanded it. He chose to accept responsibility, not because I coerced him, but because he believed, as I do, that sometimes a greater good requires the sacrifice of lesser principles. Holmes had risen and now stood before the solicitor. "You asked him to commit perjury and to accept conviction for a crime he did not commit. That is hardly leaving the decision to his conscience." "I asked him to consider whether the law in this instance served justice or merely its own procedures. Sir Lionel left explicit instructions that the charitable bequests should be protected. I honoured those instructions. If that makes me a criminal in the eyes of the law, so be it. But I do not believe I have acted unjustly. The law does not recognise degrees of criminality based upon noble intentions, Mr. Markham." "Then perhaps the law is an imperfect instrument, Mr. Holmes." Markham returned to his desk and sat down heavily. "I have spent 30 years in the service of the law, believing in its capacity to render justice. But this case has taught me that justice and legality are not always aligned. Sir Lionel obtained his fortune through deception, yes, but he also recognised his wrongdoing and sought to redirect that wealth toward beneficial purposes. Would it serve justice to destroy those charitable works simply to punish a man who is already dead? Would it serve justice to ruin an innocent woman's life to satisfy legal requirements? Would it serve justice to allow 3 relatives motivated purely by greed to profit from exposing another man's sins?" Holmes paced the length of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. When he spoke, his tone had softened slightly. "You present a compelling case, Mr. Markham, yet you have broken the law and suborned another to take blame for your actions. An innocent man sits in custody while you remain free. How do you justify that particular consequence?" "I do not justify it. I merely accept it as the cost of preventing greater harm. Parsons will not be convicted, Mr. Holmes. The evidence against him is entirely circumstantial, consisting solely of his own confession. A competent defence will argue that the confession was made under duress of financial desperation and emotional strain. He will likely receive a suspended sentence or be placed under recognizance. His career may suffer, but his mother will be cared for and his debts will be satisfied. Meanwhile, 3 institutions serving hundreds of African children will continue their work. You have considered this quite thoroughly. I have considered little else since the night I removed that docket. I have not slept soundly, Mr. Holmes. I am not proud of what I have done, but I remain convinced it was necessary. Holmes stopped his pacing and faced the solicitor directly. Mr. Markham, I am engaged to investigate the disappearance of the docket and to identify the person responsible. I have done so. You have admitted your guilt. What remains is the question of what I shall do with this information. That is a decision you must make according to your own principles, Mr. Holmes. I will not attempt to influence you further. The 2 men regarded each other in silence, and I sensed that some communication passed between them that went beyond words. Finally Holmes spoke, and his voice carried a note of weary understanding. I believe, Mr. Markham, that you have broken the law, but perhaps preserved a greater justice. You have placed an innocent man at risk of conviction, yet you have also protected institutions that serve innocent children. You have suppressed evidence, yet you have honoured your client's final wishes. These are contradictions I cannot easily resolve. Nor can I, Mr. Holmes. But I have made my choice and must live with its consequences. Holmes turned to me. Come, Watson. We have learned what we came to discover. As we departed Markham's chambers and emerged into the evening air, I found myself deeply troubled by what had transpired. The case, which had begun as a simple matter of theft, had revealed itself to be a profound moral dilemma, admitting of no easy resolution. "What will you do?" I asked as we walked through the darkening streets. Holmes did not answer immediately. When he spoke, his words surprised me. "I shall report to Mr. Penbury that I have determined the identity of the person who removed the docket. I shall explain the motives and methods employed, and I shall leave to him the decision of whether to pursue the matter further or to accept that justice has been served. If not through legal channels, then through the operation of conscience and the protection of charitable works. You will not inform the police? I am not a policeman, Watson. I am a consulting detective engaged to solve a problem. I have solved it. What others choose to do with that solution is beyond my mandate." It was, I reflected, a characteristically subtle distinction, one that preserved both Holmes's integrity and his recognition that this case existed in a realm where legal guilt and moral responsibility did not neatly align. Chapter 10. Law, Mercy, and Reason. The days following our confrontation with Mr. Markham brought a resolution to the affair that was as discreet as it was unexpected. Holmes submitted his report to Mr. Penbury in writing, detailing his findings with clinical precision while offering no recommendation as to what action should be taken. The senior clerk received this document with evident distress, spending the better part of an afternoon closeted in his office, before emerging with a decision that surprised no one who understood the delicate nature of the matter. Mr. Penbury chose to present Holmes's findings to the parties most directly affected, Miss Hatherley, Mr. Markham, and the trustees of the charitable institutions, while declining to inform Scotland Yard or to pursue criminal charges. His reasoning, as he explained to us during a subsequent meeting at Baker Street, was grounded in both practical and moral considerations. "The docket is gone," said he, sitting in the chair by our fire with a cup of tea warming his hands. "It cannot be recovered. Young Parsons' confession, whether true or false, has been accepted by the authorities, and the case is officially closed. To reopen it would require presenting evidence against Mr. Markham, which would necessarily expose Sir Lionel's fraudulent dealings and invalidate the charitable bequests. The very outcome Mr. Markham committed his crime to prevent would be achieved through his prosecution." "A paradox worthy of the Greeks," Holmes observed from his position by the window. "Indeed. And so I have concluded that the interests of justice are better served by allowing the matter to rest. Mr. Markham has resigned from his position as an executor of the estate, citing personal reasons. He has also offered to make a substantial contribution to a fund for young Parsons, independent of any previous arrangements. Miss Hatherley, upon learning the full truth of her uncle's affairs, has requested that her inheritance be reduced in accordance with the codicil, preferring a modest income to wealth derived from questionable sources. And Parsons? I inquired. The magistrate reviewing the evidence found the case against him too weak to justify a trial. His confession was deemed the product of emotional distress and financial anxiety, rather than genuine guilt. He has been released under recognizance and will return to his position at Gray's Inn, though I suspect he carries a burden of knowledge that will weigh upon him for some time. Holmes turned from the window. Then all parties have achieved a form of justice, if not the variety prescribed by law. Perhaps that is the best we can hope for in such cases, Mr. Holmes. The law is designed to address clear violations of established rules, but human affairs are rarely so tidy. Sometimes the pursuit of a legal justice would create greater injustice than it resolves. After Mr. Penbury had departed, Holmes remained by the window for a considerable time, gazing out at the London evening. I busied myself with correspondence, giving him the silence I knew he required to process the conclusion of the case. When at last he spoke, there was a quality to his voice I had rarely heard, something approaching uncertainty. Watson, I find myself troubled by this affair in ways I did not anticipate. How so? He turned to face me, and I saw in his expression a rare vulnerability. I have built my career upon the application of reason to the solution of problems. I have believed that truth, once discovered, should be acted upon regardless of consequences. Yet in this case, I find that truth and justice pull in opposite directions. Markham committed a crime, yet to punish him would destroy the good he sought to preserve. Parsons accepted false guilt, yet to expose his innocence would invalidate his sacrifice. The law would render one verdict, conscience another, and reason seems insufficient to reconcile them. You believe you made the wrong choice in not going to the police? I believe I made a choice that satisfied neither the absolute demands of law nor the pure requirements of truth. I compromised, Watson. That is not something I do comfortably or often. I set aside my pen and considered my response carefully. Holmes, I have accompanied you on enough cases to know that you're not a man who worships rules for their own sake. You pursue truth because it serves justice, not because it satisfies some abstract principle. In this case, the truth would have served no one's interest save perhaps our own satisfaction at having solved the puzzle completely. Is that sufficient reason to destroy charitable works and ruin innocent lives? You sound like Markham. Perhaps Markham was right. Holmes moved to his chair and settled into it with a sigh. I have spent this entire investigation observing the conflict between law and conscience in others. Miss Hatherley torn between inheritance and integrity. Markham struggling between legal duty and moral obligation. Parsons choosing between self-preservation and loyalty. I did not expect to find myself facing a similar conflict. Yet you have resolved it in the only way that preserves both truth and mercy. You discovered what happened and who was responsible. You reported your findings to the appropriate authority. What Mr. Penbury chose to do with that information was his decision, not yours. You cannot be held responsible for the actions of others. Can I not? I knew when I submitted that report what Mr. Penbury was likely to do with it. I could have gone directly to Inspector Bradstreet. I chose not to. That was a deliberate decision to place the matter in hands that would resolve it through discretion rather than prosecution. Then you chose wisely. He smiled faintly. You're generous in your assessment, old friend. I hope you are correct. In the weeks that followed, I observed the aftermath of the case unfold with a sense of cautious satisfaction. Young Parsons returned to his duties at Gray's Inn. His reputation somewhat tarnished, but his position secure. His mother's health improved under continued medical care, and the debts that had driven him to such desperation were quietly settled. He never spoke publicly of his false confession, and those who knew the truth maintained their discretion. Miss Hatherley moved to a smaller residence in Bloomsbury, living modestly on the income provided by the reduced inheritance she had requested. I encountered her once by chance at a lecture on African education reform, and she struck me as a woman who had found peace in reconciling her circumstances with her principles. She asked after Holmes with genuine warmth, expressing gratitude for his handling of a matter that might have destroyed many lives. Mr. Markham continued his practice, though he no longer accepted cases involving estate law. He devoted increasing amounts of time to charitable work, serving without compensation on the boards of several African educational institutions. Holmes and he maintained a distant but respectful relationship, occasionally consulting on matters of legal interpretation when Holmes's cases required such expertise. The charitable institutions endowed by Sir Lionel Hatherley flourished, serving hundreds of children who would never know the morally ambiguous origins of the wealth that sustained their schools and hospitals. In this, at least, some measure of redemption had been achieved. One evening, perhaps 3 months after the conclusion of the case, I found Holmes once again at the window, smoking his pipe and watching the street below. I'd just finished writing up an account of another of his cases, one far less morally complex, and was contemplating whether the Hatherley affair was suitable for publication. "You're thinking of chronicling this case," Holmes said without turning from the window. I confess the thought had occurred to me, though I wonder whether the public would appreciate its complexities or would simply see it as a failure to bring a criminal to justice. Then perhaps it is better left unrecorded, at least for the present. Some cases serve to enlighten through their solutions. Others teach through their ambiguities. And which category does this one occupy? He turned now, and I saw in his face that familiar expression of sharp intelligence tempered by hard-won wisdom. This case has taught me, Watson, that we are not merely students of crime, but of the human condition itself. We examine not only the mechanics of wrongdoing, but the motives that drive people to transgress, the circumstances that compel them to choose between competing obligations, and the consequences that flow from those choices. The law provides a framework for order, but it is reason, applied with mercy and understanding, that achieves something approaching justice. That is rather philosophical for you. Perhaps I am growing philosophical in my middle years, or perhaps I am simply acknowledging what I have always known but rarely admitted, that the world is more complex than any system of rules can adequately address, and that the detective's art must sometimes consist not in achieving perfect solutions, but in accepting imperfect ones that nevertheless preserve what is most essential. I rose and stood beside him at the window, looking out at the city that had been the stage for so many of our adventures. "Then you have no regrets about how this matter concluded?" "I did not say that. I have considerable regrets. But I also have the satisfaction of knowing that the outcome, imperfect though it may be, serves the interests of those who were innocent while honouring the final intentions of one who sought, however belatedly, to atone for his wrongs. That is not perfect justice, Watson, but it may be the closest approximation we can achieve in an imperfect world." The fire crackled softly in the grate, and outside the window, London pursued its endless motion, indifferent to the small dramas of conscience and compromise that played out within its boundaries. I reflected that Holmes, for all his reputation as a man of pure logic and absolute principles, possessed a humanity that his admirers rarely perceived, but that I had been privileged to witness throughout our long association. The case of the vanished court docket was closed, though not in the manner prescribed by law. Yet in its resolution, I believe we achieved something perhaps more valuable, an understanding that justice must sometimes be found not in the rigid application of rules, but in the careful exercise of reason tempered by mercy, and in the recognition that we are all criminals and innocents alike, struggling to navigate the complex terrain between what is legal and what is right. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson any case can teach.